next speakers for their social media presence of our conference, because they were actually adding stuff onto Instagram, and I think we were liked several times, quite often. A lot, yes. Which is even better. Thank you so much for all this work as well. But let me start in a different way. Thanks for being here, Sven Baier and Damian Troxler. The two speakers are scientific collaborators in our project Devotion and Memory. They are master students at the University of Teacher Education in Lucerne. Their present fields of research are, on the one hand, political education. That's also the field where they are currently writing and terminating their master thesis. And on the other hand, of course, the topic they are talking to us today on iconographic devotion in pupils' daily life. We are transferring into the field of didactics. The two of them are binding together memory and didactics, and I think their talk is especially going to be interesting also for all those working in the field of pastoral or teaching in the field of pastoral theology. I'm very glad to give you the floor, Damian and Sven.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for inviting us to the conference. Especially many thanks to Stefan Tertune and Franziska Metzger. I think with the field of didactics and the teacher's view, we move to quite a different perspective, so you may also expect something quite different now. Because in terms of learning success, it is vital to relate contents of one's teaching to daily life experiences of one's learners. In our case, these are pupils on secondary 1 level with an average age of 12 to 15. According to social constructivism, outlined by Lev Vygotsky, learning takes only place in the so-called zone of proximate development, which is meant as the linking stage between previous knowledge, so content one already knows, and the new content of the lesson. So the question for us as teachers has to be, where do pupils come across religion and religious items? They may stroll around on a market day in Lucerne and find these wooden Buddhas next to carved animal figures. Or they may surf the online market and look at this 16-inch Sacred Heart of Jesus statue just above an advertisement for kitchen tools. However, religious items may well be found in the classroom and lead to disputes and sometimes even intolerance. Like in other European countries, issues regarding religious clothing and the placement of religious symbols inside the classroom were fiercely debated in Switzerland. Our approach is meant to raise awareness for religious diversity and individual iconographic devotion in a class, but also in between members of this certain class. For this purpose, we refer to Meyer and Houtman's concept of things, emphasizing an interplay between object and beholder, and we follow their pragmatic approach to religion, which puts questions about beliefs a bit aside and rather raises questions like how does a religion materialize and which things do religions involve. On the other hand, we would also like to enable intercultural learning in the classroom. In order to achieve intercultural sensitivity, we employ the development model by American sociologist Milton J. Bennett. The model, as you see on the bottom, moves from ethnocentric stages, which are all ways of avoiding cultural difference, to ethno-relative stages, which can be seen as ways of actually seeking cultural difference. So the 3 stages of avoiding cultural difference would be denial, defense, and minimalization, whereas the ways of seeking cultural difference would be acceptance, adaptation, and integration. Now, if we as teachers intend to combine and implement these approaches in our lessons, one question that must not be neglected is, what does the curriculum say? The so-called Curriculum 21, a relatively new, comprehensive, harmonized collection of competences for the Swiss school system, incorporated the area of religion inside the subject life skills, which is therefore a very broad subject. There we find a competence relating to the influence of religion on culture and society. Just to clarify the term competence as we use it here, it is what we in German would term as Handlungswissen, so we may translate it with action knowledge. It is meant as not only knowledge, but the ability of doing something. Then one historical example we would employ in order to achieve that is the cult of the Sacred Heart in 18th and 19th century France. And here we come back to the political dimension. It strikes us as representative for the way in which iconographic religious devotion affects both adherents and opponents, while for believers, bearing the image of the Sacred Heart on one's body was considered a protection against evils caused by the French Revolution. For Republican opponents, it rather served as striking evidence for counter-revolutionary engagement, was frequently used in trials, and eventually led to convictions and even death penalties. So, as you see here, these cloth or paper badges were either used as protection or as evidence, depending on the perspective one took on the Sacred Heart. What we can discuss with pupils is what advantages and drawbacks they face when belonging to a certain religion, but also to a party or just a group. They may enjoy strong identification among group members, which is the in-group, but they may well face a lack of understanding and intolerance or even discrimination when it comes to showing their affiliation to an out-group. Also, the example of the Sacred Heart teaches us that what is considered religious devotion by some might be regarded as idolatry by others. Professor Morgan said yesterday, but also in his previous writings, that how controversially the question of the Sacred Heart was debated even among Catholics. Crucial questions seem to be, is the second commandment affected when worshipping a single organ, which would suggest a form of idolatry, or can the heart rather be considered a symbol, which would mean it is just another way of worshipping Jesus? Finally, when we turn to early Christian explorers, we find that they labeled beliefs they encountered and they hadn't known before as idolatry, whereas nowadays we consider faiths like Hinduism and Buddhism proper religions. There are also contemporary issues we face and that should be discussed in the classroom. For example, how do we deal with religious items like crucifixes or religious clothing like hijabs? If we want to take an ethnocentrist view, we may consider Christian items part of our cultural heritage and therefore superior. If we follow a minimalization approach, which would be in the middle of the model by Bennett, we may want to be consistent and ban every religious item from the classroom. Or, if we move to an ethno-relative perspective, we may do the contrary and permit them all. Another question is whether devotions to lucky charms, necklaces, and tattoos can already be considered individual devotions equal to religions. If so, can they therefore request the same tolerance? Just to employ a brief example, when we went to school, which in my case wasn't extraordinarily long ago, it was forbidden for boys to wear caps or hats in a lesson. But then suddenly we had Muslim girls wearing hijabs. And this puts the teacher in a difficult position. Can you really argue that religious clothings are permitted while other clothings are not, while representing a secular school system? These we find a very interesting question, and we would be glad to discuss that later in the discussion and benefit from your expert knowledge. What you also find is that the modern age is generally associated with a process of secularization and disenchantment, at least according to the sociologist Max Weber. However, does that mean that people nowadays are less spiritual? Some recent research suggests otherwise. For example, Oprez would say that the disenchanted worldview provides fertile ground for New Age spirituality, and academic attention should not only focus on the secularization of religious items, but also turn to what he calls the spiritualization of commodities. My colleague Sven Baier will in a few minutes outline a whole area of commodities that are spiritualized today. I would like to conclude with a citation by Birgit Meyer, a religious professor, which kind of opened my eyes on the subject of iconographic devotion. She says that, quote, "The more important point is that the idea of an immaterial religion is a fiction. Even a semiotic ideology that denounces religious things and pictures cannot do without material forms," unquote. And with that, I would like to hand over to my colleague, Sven Baier.
Thank you, Damian. Now, I would like to reflect the relationship of religion to the current social form. Moreover, the role of religion in today's society. How can we teach religion to our pupils? How can we bring the cultural power of religion closer to the pupils? We live in a secularized time, but the religious consciousness has not disappeared. As we know, the process of secularization in society are clearly related to process of modernization, at least in Europe. These processes have brought social changes and transformations, and they are clearly linked to the decline of religiosity. But especially in the field of sociology and religion, there are theses which see a desecularization of modern societies. Also, according to Jürgen Habermas, religion has not disappeared. In his speech 2001 of the German Book Trade Peace Prize on the subject of faith and knowledge, he presented his post-secularization thesis. According to Jürgen Habermas, we live in a post-secular time. Post-secular societies are those that adapt to the continuity of religious communities in their secularized world. The idea of secularization, that religion is disappearing in the course of modernization, is losing more and more ground. Religion has worldwide public significance. Habermas argues that in the age of globalization and digitization, the secularized societies in Europe have to face religious movements, for example, fundamentalism, and they encounter those religion movements with their own society as well as worldwide. Jürgen Habermas speaks of a vitality of the world's religion and of a cultural force that still has power over the centuries. Modern societies remain sensitive to religious content, and religious consciousness still exists. However, it is necessary to translate religious in such a way that its contents are understood by post-secular society and especially young people, our pupils. So, where can traces of religiosity be found in the secular world? Outside the church and pastoral efforts, how can a language be found for these traces which the post-secular society understand, especially the young adults, our pupils? One of the languages that today's youth understand is the language of football. Is a connection between religiosity and football too much a constructed or simplified motive? Or are there really similarities between football and religiosity? Well, there are well-founded references and evidence in the work of numerous religious scientists and sociologists. For example, the religious scholar Werner Veit describes that football use a vocabulary and terminologies that have their origin in religion. So we naturally use terms such as, also we use these terms in German, they are translated. We use terms such as football god, miracle, the sacred pitch, the endearing goal, and we talk about the hand of God. Well, we talk about that hand of God later. There are just a few examples, but it is not only about the vocabulary itself, rather how it's used in football. The summoning of a football god during the game is taken for granted. Nobody doubts the use of the term. The use of such a vocabulary is seen as a necessary part of the repertoire, even for intellectual and enlightened football fans. Werner Veit recognizes in football an integrative, meaningful, and identifying dimension in the same way as religion fulfills these dimensions. For the development of the meaningful dimension, sport relies on symbols and rituals that have been shaped by religion, which rich use of emblems and a highly ritualized action, a feeling of togetherness is conveyed. Let's focus on rituals for the moment. Rituals as social practices. Emil Durkheim describes in his religion theory forms of collective rituals, rituals, mostly by signing and I go to this part again. Emil Durkheim describes in his religion theory forms of collective rituals which are connected with a state of collective excitement, mostly by singing and dancing together. He refers to examples, the totemism of Central Australian or North American tribes, which he regarded as the oldest and the same time simplest social form of religion. He assumed that all later religious phenomena could be inferred from this. He located these community rituals in their function as binding of the individual to the collective. Through the common rites, the religious community and thus also the individual members confirmed and assert themselves. Rituals can be instruments of social integrations, of constructions of us, of shared values. Let's compare now religious rituals and football rituals. Well, the first part, moral communities. In both religious celebrations and football matches, the members of a specific community come together and share a certain amount of excitement. And the believers express their excitement with words, songs, gestures that all are codified. They adapt their own rhythm to the collective rhythm and share a collective emotional state. And, as I mentioned before, individuals experience social integration in which they live shared values. Next point. Sacred time. The religious community and the football community each have their own unique calendar. The ritual celebrations and matches of each community are repeated in a certain cyclical rhythm that interrupt the rhythm of the ordinary life. Next point. Sacred space. Both religious and football rituals take place in a sacred space. These places differ from places of public life. they have different and special rules. For example, the way to behave or the way to dress. Organization and rules. Like the church, football has its own laws and strict hierarchies, from FIFA to local clubs. The same rules apply everywhere, and the international committee at the top watches over everything. Religious references can also be seen in the history of football. The combination of rituals related to religion and football dates back to the Renaissance. Football in the modern sense did not exist then. In Italy, a game with quasi-religious traits was created in that time. The game Calcio later gave rise to football as we know it today. The game had quite different rules and rituals back then. In France and England, the game Soul was only played after the service and only after religious holidays. The priest blessed the ball, which were thrown down from a steeple from the church tower, and also the players were blessed. In medieval England and France, football was one of the fast night customs and so a part of religious festive traditions. In England and France, folk football was played by the common people, while the nobility and the authorities preferred to hunt, ride horses, or do military exercises. In contrast, the Italian calcio, which was played in Florence during the Renaissance, was reserved for the nobility. Even if the game has changed a lot since then, the religious references have massively influenced the ritual character of the game and still do today. In the early days, theologians played an important role in the development of football. Thanks. In England, for example, Thomas Arnold, a principal of a rugby school and a member of the Anglican Church, he tried to develop this school into a school for Christian gentlemen. This was in the time of the industrialization. The school wanted to herald a new era in education. Furthermore, Arnold wanted to steer the playfulness of the pupils in the right direction. Before, football had been regarded as a sign of rebellion and was only played during the leisure time. Arnold began to integrate football into the official teaching. His aim was to win back control by the inclusion of the subservice game. Arnold saw football as an opportunity to promote male virtues such as discipline, selflessness, and the idea of fair play. Another example refers to a German school. Dr. Konrad Koch, principal of a high school in Braunschweig and a studied theologian, tried to bring sports and team-building activities into the classroom. This was around 1870. He also chooses football as a teaching subject. With the introduction of football, Koch wanted to bring not only physical education lessons, but also ethical values such as discipline and team spirit into the classroom. But of course, there was resistance against this new form of education. Koch and his colleagues were attacked as game apostles, because for the traditional gymnastic circle, football was not a sporting activity. Surprising, but football triggers passion, whether positive or negative, and usually with an enormous intensity. It seems as if a large part of the world is fond of this game. Football is a universal point of reference, regardless of region, nation, generation. For the reason given, football can be seen as a form of language, of mediation, understood by many. In addition to the examples mentioned, there are other central ones that show a clear reference to the cult of the Sacred Heart. Focusing on great individuals can lead to a personal cult around football stars. In Latin America, this is best exemplified by the Iglesia Maradoniana, the Church of Diego Maradona, that worships the Argentinian football player Diego Maradona. The symbol for the church is Dios, written D10S, as you can see on the picture, which combines the Spanish word for gods and Dios with 10, the former shirt number of Diego Maradona. Moreover, the church has created a chant that is repeated at all ceremonies and worship services. The Iglesia Maradoniana meets twice a year. Once to celebrate the birth of Maradona on Maradona Christmas, and again for Maradona Easter, the date that the Argentinian team beat England in the 1986 World Cup quarterfinals with the goal from Maradona known as the infamous Hand of God goal. Of course, the Iglesia Maradoniana, the Maradona Church, cannot be compared with an established religion. The veneration of Maradona nevertheless reaches dimensions that are more than astonishing. Although we come to this in a few minutes. Yes. Although the Iglesia Maradoniana is more like a parody of religion, many followers seem to take it seriously. On these pictures, you can see almost the devotion on their faces. And there seems to be no doubt where the origin of the liturgy lies. Symbols and rituals are taken from the Christian Catholic liturgy. Yes, please. Thanks. Of course, the Iglesia Maradoniana, the Maradona Church, the rituals are unmistakably taken from the Christian veneration of saints. There are numerous devotional objects that serve the worship of the Santo Diego. The image of the Santo Diego is unmistakably linked with the iconography of devotional objects. The design of the Santo Diego was further developed, and it may surprise you, or maybe not, to see Diego Maradona as Santo Diego with the Sacred Heart. This iconic devotional style combines football with classic religious elements, and this devotional picture spreads worldwide and can be seen in numerous places. It is seen in many continents, in Europe, in Latin America, of course. The Santo Diego devotional picture is not only presented on poster, but with preference also in personal shrines. Such shrines contain a mixture of religious objects and representations of everyday culture, and such shrines are of great importance for football fans. Even the touch of such objects also seem to have a meaning in order to feel the presence of the sacred. Why do we talk about these pictures? Why do we talk about Santo Diego? Well, football, with its worldwide popularity and passion, can serve as an example for religious education. No other sport brings so many spectators into the stadiums or in front of the television. Nevertheless, it is clear that football remains football and is not religion. An objectively and inadmissible connection must be avoided, but still it is important to find a language that young people understand. Especially when teaching young people, you have to find a topic that is relevant to them. With such images which have a cultural meaning and relevance for young people, and access to the world of pupils can be created. Through this approach, an understanding for religious questions and topics can be created. Especially in football, there are many connections to be found. Rituals, tattoo with religious motives, footballers who cross themselves, fans who pray, and much more. By highlighting these elements, pupil can reflect on the value and awareness of religion.
All right. To conclude here, and come back to our objective from the beginning, I think that what Sven Baier outlined seems to be an appropriate and promising way of explaining religious iconographic devotion to non-religious pupils. Introducing football as a replacement religion in the classroom may well lead to curiosity and eventually to the willingness to deal with proper religion devotion. We would then not only achieve a better understanding of religious devotion, but also growing intercultural sensitivity inside the classroom. Thank you for your attention